So let's start there. Let's bring DDS into the conversation. Hello.
Hi, Nina.
What a joy to have you here, an absolute joy. You know how grateful I am to you, and you also know how much I enjoyed your book, because I think I've told you about 100 times over the last few weeks, and I will keep waving it at various points during today's webinar. Diversity plus inclusion equals belonging. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I want to, just listening to your introduction and talking about me and talking about the book, just want to say thank you for the opportunity. But also, it's very, very surreal to hear that something that started out as a passion project for me and was an academic paper that got turned into a book that feels so accessible to you. It boggles my mind, honestly. But anyway, I know that's not what you asked. So the diversity plus inclusion equals belonging is the equation that I write about in the book. And it would also be remiss of me if I didn't credit that the kernel of that idea came from a colleague of mine that I was working with some years ago. And it was through a woman called Kalpita Patel, who I adore, and nobody on this call will know her, but I think it is really important when we're talking about inclusion and belonging to make sure that people are attributed for their ideas.
Absolutely.
and that we don't steal work from people and ideas from people, which I know is commonplace experience for women to feel. Oftentimes, women will talk about the experience they have of men repeating their ideas and taking credit for it. So I am not going to do that. So thank you, Kalpita. The idea that diversity plus inclusion equals belonging is really this, that diversity is a fact, and it is binary in that your organization, your team either is or is not diverse. And a very quick litmus test is, when I look around, do I see people who are like me, and do I see people who are not like me? And if you can answer yes to both of those questions, then you've probably got a relatively diverse working space. Diversity is not enough. Right? Diversity is not enough to lead towards this experience of belonging. What you then need once you've got diversity is the behavior of inclusion. And I talk about behavior as both being the behavior of the organization, i.e. the policies, the programs, the platforms, the processes that an organization deploys as it's going about its business. And then the behavior of the people in the organization, and very, very specifically, the behavior of people in senior positions in an organization, because I've long time said that the culture of any organization will be shaped by the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate in a leader. So if you have diversity, and then if you add into that the behaviors of inclusion, then we get to a place of belonging. And it is that experience of belonging, the idea that when I walk into a place, and I'm sure everybody on this call has had an experience in their life, probably more than one, when they've walked into a place and they felt it in their bones that they do not belong there. They felt the vibe, and they've felt it in their body, they've felt it in their emotions. And realize that where they are is not where they should be, and have made haste to exit. Equally, I'm pretty certain that that everyone has also experienced belonging. The moment when you walk into a place, or you have an experience where you're like, oh yeah, these are my people, this is my place. I feel I have an experience of psychological safety. And which I talk about in the book is that is the experience that we have when it's not expensive to be, ourselves. And so diversity plus inclusion equals belonging. You can't have belonging if you don't have inclusion. You can't have inclusion if you don't have diversity. But you can have diversity without inclusion, right? So that's why I say diversity is not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. It's bringing to mind a quote, and I'm falling right into the trap here because I can't remember the name of the lady who to attribute the quote to. So I will do some research and I will add that into the links. But there was a quote around diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance.
Oh,
and I've heard so many examples. I was very privileged to have lunch a few years ago, just before the pandemic stopped such a thing, with a fabulous group of people who were all senior women, all from the transport industry, not just rail, but different elements of the transport industry. And some of the examples that they were sharing with me blew my mind in terms of the behaviour that still exists around, for example, well, they're all executive directors, so there is a box being ticked there because their organisations can all say, well, yes, we have at least one woman on our board, and in some cases more. But what was happening, without exception, they all had the same experience, and this kind of came out in the conversation, that they would go to meetings and it became apparent that the agenda and any key items on the agenda that needed debate or discussion had already been debated and discussed, and a consensus reached amongst their male colleagues before it was then brought to the table, and a decision was announced because the discussion had already been held. I think when we kind of talk about the inclusion being the behaviour of people, and yes, the policies and the procedures are key, but the behaviour of senior people within an organisation is so fundamental to what's going to happen for us to get to that belonging stage. So if that's an example of how not to behave as a senior person who wants to encourage inclusion in the workplace, what are the good stuff, the good things that you're seeing with organisations that you've been involved with and worked with? What would we class as some quite straightforward best practices that senior leaders could be doing?
I mean, there is one that I often tell to senior leaders that, you know, the quickest way to kill creativity is to let the leader speak first. And sometimes you want to kill creativity, right? And sometimes the leader purposefully does speak first in order to influence the room in a certain direction. But whatever it is that the leader says or does is then how the room follows. So you better be jolly well careful about how you're having the room follow. And so it can be really simple as keeping an eye. You know, if you are a leader and you're sitting around a meeting room table or a boardroom table or whatever environment it is that you're in, whether it's virtual or physical, pay attention to who speaks first, pay attention to who speaks most, pay attention to who's getting credit, and pay attention to who you call on and what you call on them for. And just pay attention to that and just notice if there are any patterns that are emerging for yourself. I've seen it 25 years in a career. I've seen, you know, I've facilitated workshops, I've facilitated boardroom offsites, and oftentimes it will be a man that speaks first and most. It will be a white person that speaks first and most. It will be a straight person that speaks first and most. It will be someone who is not disabled that speaks first and most. And so I as the facilitator, you as the leader, have a really powerful role and a really influential role to turn that around and to invite people into the conversation. to make sure they not only that they have a seat at the table, but they are given that the room is created for them to use the voice that they have at the seat of that table. So it's just a really simple thing that we can do, is just pay attention at the level of process versus the level of content when you're in a meeting.
Yeah, and that just speaks volumes to me in terms of that level of awareness that somebody can have within that environment. That being aware of what other people have to contribute. If they're not contributing, being sensitive enough to know how to enable them to contribute. There's a few things that's coming up here that's kind of taking me into an area that you mentioned earlier, DDS, around psychological safety.
Yes.
Now, I know that this is an area that Alex feels really passionate about. So, Toby, can I ask you to bring Alex back into the discussion? I feel like we've sat him in the naughty corner somewhere, so I think we need to get him back on the screen, as long as he's not gone off and he's not walking the dogs on the shores of Loch Tay. So, psychological safety. The example that you've just shared, DDS, around people being in that meeting environment and feeling that they are being encouraged, enabled, supported to contribute. That, for me, would be a sign of psychological safety. Now, I'm keen to understand, because it's a relatively new phrase, is this. Maybe for the last 3 or 4 years, it's been appearing in conversations, but it's still relatively new. And it would really help me if I could understand what your definition of psychological safety is. And then if I can bring Alex in as well, in terms of what it means for you, Alex, in that kind of day-to-day practical term as a leader of an organisation.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it might be a word that is being used with more frequency now, but it was actually a term that was coined in the 1960s. It was first published in the 1960s. And from my perspective, psychological safety is the experience that we have when it's not expensive to be ourselves. And when we are experiencing psychological safety, we are more likely to be able to say things like, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I need help, I don't know. Or we're more likely to be able to say things like, I have an idea, or I think there's a better way of us doing this. And I think psychological safety is also, as a rail industry veteran, I know how important health and safety is, and I think psychological safety can be directly correlated to physical safety on the railways. And I think, it was really interesting, Nina, for you I heard you say at the beginning of the webinar, this is a safe space. And I want to encourage people to stop using that term, because I don't think anybody can lay claims to a space being safe just by saying it's a safe space. We have to behave in ways that encourage and facilitate people's psychological safety. What we can do instead of saying this is a safe space, we can say we want this to be an intentionally brave space, where that you can feel the discomfort, that you feel that you can that you're not necessarily feeling wholly comfortable with what you're about to say and what you're about to do, but that you feel the fear and do it anyway, and that is met with the care and empathy and the behaviors that are needed to encourage that experience of psychological safety.
That's such a good point, because just because you say it doesn't make it so.
It does not.
So a really good point. And this word, all 3 words actually, intentionally brave space, where we can have that. I heard this expression a couple of years ago about accepting the need to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And to just, I guess, put ourselves in that position of needing to be brave, because I may ask a question that could feel inappropriate. It could feel like I've worded it wrong. Maybe I should understand that already and I don't. So it's kind of all of that stuff which might prevent me from asking, but also then prevents me from being educated and understanding. Alex, psychological safety from your perspective in your day-to-day role as MD in Scotland, what does it mean to you?
Well, one of the reasons why I loved reading this book, apart from the fact I was on a sun lounger in Lanzarote, it's a positive backdrop, isn't it, to read a book, is we've been dealing a lot with how we get everyone home safe every day, whether that's the public, the passengers, or the workforce. And one of the things that prevents companies being safer than they should be is that often people won't speak up, even when they feel that they should. And so we've been working with, experts in this field and companies, and they talk about this concept of psychological safety. And it's only when people feel psychologically safe will they speak up. And I've said to them on numerous occasions, the problem with this phrase, psychological safety, is normal people don't use that language. If you talk to a driver or a conductor or a signaller about psychological safety, they won't know what you mean because it's actually quite a complex, academic, highfalutin term. So actually, if you're going to make progress on this agenda, actually turning it into a practical language that everyone can resonate, that human beings use, was really good for me. So we know people feel psychologically safe when they say those things. I don't know, I've made a mistake, I've got a concern, you're right, I've got an idea, etc., etc. So that for me resonated because it's describing the circumstances in which we can create these psychological safe environments. So for example, at the end of every meeting I chair, I always say, okay, how do we do? And in the first meeting, the sort of tumbleweed goes through the meeting, doesn't it? Because no one wants to tell the chair that actually the meeting was a bit crap and we didn't allow enough time for this bit on the agenda or what have you. But actually, over time, people will give you positive, feedback because they feel safe. But there's a direct correlation between trust and organisational performance. And that's one reason why I feel so passionate about equality, diversity, inclusion, belonging, is not just because of the legal, moral, ethical arguments for pursuing this agenda, but actually this is about good business. If we want to be profitable, if we want to delight our customers, if we want engaged employees, if we want safe, if we want to deliver a boring, reliable railway, actually we need to create an environment where everyone can come to work and be their best self. That's why I'm doing this. And one of the things I loved about this book is it bridged the EDI agenda with other agendas like safety. That's really clever. That's one reason why I love this book.
Thank you. So DDS, do you want to having kind of listened to Alex's take on it, is there anything else that you can add to that in relation to when you've seen this working really well in organisations to get people to that point where they trust the organisation or the leadership within the organisation enough to bring their whole self to work?
Well, I would imagine what Alex didn't say, and Alex wouldn't say this because Alex is just a very kind person and humble, is that how Alex responds to someone at the end of his meet. I've never been in a meeting with Alex, by the way, but I can imagine that when Alex says, "How did we do?" at the end of the meeting, and somebody eventually says, "Well, that was a bit crap," how Alex responds to "that was a bit crap" will have been the difference that made the difference as to when anybody else will speak up after that. Right? So our ability to take feedback is directly correlated to somebody's willingness to offer it. And so when we are creating a psychologically safe space, we have to be prepared to be wrong. We have to be prepared to be told we're wrong, and we have to be prepared to take accountability for our wrongdoing. So if somebody says that was a bit crap, Alex, and, you know, I noticed a time when you spoke over me, Alex can't, at that point, Alex can't go, no, I didn't. Well, or worse, can't say, well, I didn't mean to. You know, it's like this idea of valuing impact over intention. Like if I'm standing in the queue at Sainsbury's, which I haven't done for many years because I don't live in the UK anymore, but if I'm standing in the queue at Sainsbury's and someone runs their trolley into my ankles, and I look around and go, ouch, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I go, oh, well, if you didn't mean to do it, all of that pain in my ankle has gone away. We're good, thanks very much. Of course, that's not the way it is. So when somebody says, oh, ouch, you trod on my metaphoric toes, or you hurt my feelings, or I didn't like the way you said that, you can't say, well, I didn't mean to, because that doesn't undo the wrongdoing. What you say, you take accountability for the impact of your behavior, and you say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I didn't realize that I did that. Now I know I'm not going to do it again. And so if Alex isn't prepared to be wronged, or to have his behavior or his process or the way he chairs a meeting called into question, then he's never going to get feedback from anyone. And that is exactly the same. So psychological safety is something that you build over time and can be broken in an instant, just like trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I come in here on something which you were talking about earlier, about the way to kill creativity is for the most senior person to speak first?
Yeah.
So we just recruited a new COO for ScotRail called Joanne Maguire, and she's absolutely fantastic. And one of the reasons why I love working with her is because I'm learning from her. And I've worked for lots of great leaders and lots of rubbish ones as well. And you learn as much from the rubbish ones as you do as the great ones, don't you? And I worked with a guy called Mike Hodson, who was the managing director of London Midland. And in an exec meeting, and we would discuss papers and stuff, he always spoke last. He would gather feedback from around the table, and he would speak last, and then he would sort of sum up and moved on. And Joe was telling me the other day about the hippo. And I said, what do you mean about the hippo? And she said, the highest paid person's opinion.
Okay.
And
right.
most meetings, if allowed, will default to the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. And the trick of leadership and inclusion and all that good stuff is not allowing the hippo to dominate, because more often than not, that is not the outcome you want.
And there are times when you do want the hippo, right? Like if the hippo can step in and bring a spotlight to inequitable or exclusionary behaviors, that's a really great moment when the hippo can use their power. Right. So it's like, I guess that's where I'm going with the be intentional. Know what your voice does, and use your voice in a way that is going to bring about the greatest impact, the most helpful impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading something earlier today, one of the industry journals in the rail staff. They're talking about diversity and inclusion. There's some great articles in there, this issue, from various different people in the rail network. And there was kind of a list of ideas to think about, and one of them was pass the mic. It doesn't always have to be you.
Yep.
So when you're in the meeting, I think there is a tendency, because it's kind of, well, it's your meeting. If you're chairing it, it's your meeting. If you're the leader, if you're the most senior person, if you're the hippo in the room, then there is a kind of natural tendency to think, right, okay, well, we'll all wait for you to speak then. So this is really valuable stuff, and the really great word that you're using, DDS, which is really kind of striking a chord with me, is this word intentional. It's being intentional. And yes, I didn't mean to. Well, okay, but let's just kind of rewind on that and say, well, how would that have gone differently then? Because you didn't mean to meant you weren't thinking about it and you weren't being intentional. So having that acceptance that different people in the room have got different needs, and we need to be really thinking about our communication rather than just assuming we can just kind of hurtle through as we've always done. We need to think about it more. And also, I think what's coming out as well for me is that ability to be able to say respectfully, that wasn't appropriate. That didn't work for me. When you said that, or you said that in this way, feeling that I have got the opportunity and the position within that environment to be able to put my hand up and say, it didn't work for me. This is how that made me feel within that particular situation. But I think it's so challenging because as a society, that giving and receiving feedback is not necessarily a skill that we're taught. So how do you learn how to do that? How do you get good at that?
Go for it, Alex.
Well, I think some of it comes from confidence. So if you are confident in your ability, you are much more likely to ask for feedback and be prepared to listen to what that feedback says. So I think confidence is really important. So, for example, I'm a massive fan of making sure that leaders and managers are qualified in leadership and management, which might sound a novelty. And in rail, I think it still is a novelty. So the way we keep the railway safe is that we have drivers and signallers who are both competent and confident to do their roles. But actually, what I find in rail is we have a lot of people that I call accidental managers. And they're great people, and they've often done a practical task, and then we make them a manager, and then we wonder why they're not amazing. And the reason is we've never actually trained them to be amazing. We've not given qualifications in leadership and management. And, how many meetings of senior people like me sat around and moaned about the frozen middle in organisations and stuff like that. Well, even if that was true, actually senior management has created that environment because leaders and managers aren't confident in their own ability. And then the other thing is practice. So, I've just recently been through a 360 exercise, and even though I've been through it many, many times before, and it's a fantastic management tool if you've never done one before, actually when you read it in black and white, it's really hard to read that stuff about yourself in black and white, and you go, oh God, yeah, I know I do that. I know sometimes I give feedback in WhatsApp and I shouldn't. And it requires confidence. So how do you make people confident? Well, one of the ways you can do that is through experience, but the other thing is, are we training and qualifying our leaders and managers to be brilliant leaders and managers? Mm-hmm. Not always.
Yeah, I think I would add to those 2 points a little bit, and ask you to consider, who are you giving this feedback for? Are you giving it for yourself in order to prove a point, or to slap back, or to expel your own feelings, or are you actually giving it for the other person? And if you're giving it for the other person, is what you're giving worth having? And we often talk about feedback is a gift, and yet it generally doesn't. It often feels like a pile of poop rather than a gift. And it can be a gift if you are giving it to someone in a way that is going to be useful to them. And I always advocate for people to seek consent before giving feedback. So I'd like to offer you some feedback about a situation that we were just in together. Would that be okay? And if the other person says, actually, no, not right now, then you just jolly well don't give the feedback, because that individual will not be ready to hear it. And if they say, no, I don't want to hear it, you say, well, it's really important for our working relationship that I offer you this feedback. So please let me know when you're ready to hear it.
Yeah. It's so important, isn't it? That kind of skill of understanding where the need is. Do I need to give you this feedback because actually if I don't, I feel like my head's going to blow off because I'm worked up, I'm frustrated, and whatever emotions are going on. So I need to give it to you. But I also need, as you've explained, I need to have that respect that, is this a good time? Is it going to land?
Right.
Because if I give it you as a gift and it's all beautifully wrapped, that's one thing. But if I throw it at you when you're least expecting it, then it isn't going to land well.
Right. So, I remember I got a gift when I was a kid at Christmas from the people that gave birth to me, and I unwrapped it and I was like, this bloody awful jumper, and I wanted to wrap it back up and give it back. And it's like sometimes we get those gifts, and if we don't seek consent for, would you like a jumper this Christmas, or would you like a pair of socks? And you're like, actually, I'd like a pair of socks. And then that person go, okay, well, here's a pair of socks. Here's something that's going to be useful to you.
Yeah. It's a kind of so much of what I'm hearing as well is this kind of consideration for others.
Yeah.
Just consideration for how other people might be experiencing the situation.
Yeah.
Consideration in relation to what do you need? What do you need from this, and how can I help you get it? Whilst at the same time, not be, and I guess this would be, I'm stereotyping myself in terms of my gender here, but in a kind of maternal way, there is a tendency for me personally to want to make sure that you're okay. But then when I get home at the end of the day and I think, well, actually, I'm not all right. But I've spent the entire day making sure everyone else is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to remember that, when you get on a plane, when you're about to take off and they do the safety announcements, they tell you in the event of the air pressure in the cabin changing, these masks will fall down. They always tell you to put your own mask on before you help other people. And there's a reason for that. And that's a great metaphor for just being in life in general. And it is your needs are as important as everybody else's. And it's a very simple statement, but it draws our attention to recognizing that I am not more important than you. My time is no more valuable than yours. And the same applies to you, right? And so when we can come together and recognize that we are both whole individuals who both have needs, and it's a negotiation about how to get those needs met, that's when you start to get into that space of psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point you've made in relation to that, the accidental manager, is so pertinent, because there tends to be this assumption that because somebody can get through a recruitment process and a series of interviews and perhaps a psychometric test or two, and then they get a job that's got manager in the title, then automatically they know how to lead people. And the leadership skills that people need when they go from doing a role without a team of direct reports into one that has is so critical. Mm-hmm. But quite often, well, you've got the job, so therefore you must be able to do it. And that's a great opportunity for us to tell the audience that you've got a new book coming out in September as well. So there you go. Leadership is a behaviour, not a title. Do you like how I did that? That was seamless. 27th of September. So the second book coming out, which I can't wait to read.